our next guest in the story, of course, Officer David Dorn. You can go to ladderwithcrowdershop.com and purchase this shirt. All proceeds will go to the family affected. I believe we have her on. Miss Ann Dorn, can you hear me?
I can.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you making the time. And what do you prefer, Mrs. Ann Dorn, Miss Dorn, Ann? It's obviously this is a sensitive subject, and you're on under circumstances that I wish were different, and I get intensely uncomfortable.
I'm sorry, I had an echo. I couldn't hear you very well.
That's okay. It was just me making nonsensical statements. I'll go with Miss Dorn, Mrs. Dorn. Listen, for people who may not know this story, we were just talking about the media, what they cover, what they don't cover. And for people who've watched this stream, we did show a portion of the video of your husband, your late husband, an American hero. And it was one of the hardest things that I ever had watched on air. We actually had to cut to someone else. I had to kind of gather myself. But unfortunately, a lot of people out there, and we just found this out last week by the Black Lives Matter activists with whom we spoke on the street in Austin, they weren't familiar with this story at all. Could you sort of brief people, for those who aren't in the know, which unfortunately is too many?
The night of June 2nd, my husband was helping a friend, as he always does, and he was answering an alarm call. Which he's done numerous times before without any problems. And during that call, he was shot by a looter. Unfortunately, was killed.
Yeah, and that's the short end of it. I think people should know that your husband, Officer David Dorn, he was a part of the St. Louis PD for how many? Was it 30-something years?
He spent 38 years with the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. He retired as a captain.
Right, and you yourself as well, if I'm not mistaken, you're a sergeant?
I'm a sergeant, yes.
Okay.
27 years.
27 years. So both police officers, and we'll get into kind of the Explorers program, which you did with young people interested in law enforcement. And I want to make sure that people know there is going to be, before we move on, a peace march on August 29th in downtown St. Louis that I believe you're a part of, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, correct. On the 29th at 10 a.m.
And what do you intend to accomplish with this peace march right now? Because obviously there are plenty of marches, or as people in the media would say, peaceful protests going on across the country. It almost sounds like, well, why do we need another peaceful march? It's almost as though there's a contrast with what's actually going on right now.
I'm trying to bring all walks of life together. Everyone on both sides of the debate, the good and the bad. The right and the wrong, everybody has their own opinions, but I want to start the conversation. I want to start the healing process. I've worked with kids. I worked with youth for 27 years, and I want us to reach out to them, and I want to figure out, how do we heal the community? How do we start? We have to start at home first and figure out what's broken. And I want to figure out, like I said, I want to figure out what's broken so we can try and heal.
Yeah.
And try and bring some peace back to the community.
Well, I think sorry, go. I know there is a little bit of an echo, so I apologize if I interrupt. I'm also interrupting myself right now. So we're both the victim of my blabbermouth. Let me ask you this, because right now, obviously, the narrative is that what is broken is the police force, and that they are targeting young Black Americans in record numbers right now. That's why we have the Black Lives Matter protest. That's what people believe, true or not. I think a lot of people aren't aware that there's a higher percentage of police officers who are minorities than the general population. And unfortunately, they often get the worst. They get the brunt of it because sometimes they're seen as traitors, or they're seen as Uncle Tom. This has happened a lot. My dad was raised in Detroit. He was there during the Detroit riots. He had a friend who had a father who was a Black officer. He had to go home in unmarked cars back then. Considering how it's almost, they are unsung heroes, and often Black officers aren't given the credit that they deserve, why would someone like your husband, David Dorn, go into, what inspired him to go into what is unfortunately often a thankless role?
He just loved helping the community. He's always been a giving spirit. He's always been a godly man. Whatever he could do to help somebody is what led him in that direction. His father was a reserve officer years and years ago, when very few Blacks were even on the department and allowed to be on the department. So I think having his father as a reserve officer really inspired him to follow in his footsteps.
Well, yeah, and that's interesting that he wanted to serve his community, he wanted to help people, and he saw becoming a police officer as a way to do that. And I'd like to continue on that. Miss Ann Dorn, again, that is the March for Peace, August 29th. Is there a place people can go to find more information on this?
It's Peace March STL on Facebook.
On Facebook.
Just type in Peace March STL.
For as long as that is still allowed to be up, and I hope it does remain up. Let me ask you this. Why do you think that your husband, when he wanted to serve his community, like you said, he was a giving person, and he thought that the best way to do that was by joining the police force? And obviously, you felt the same way. You're a sergeant yourself. That's something that we don't hear a whole lot about, that we often hear about teachers, right? They just want to help children. But I think we often don't hear that people look at their communities that are broken and say, well, you know what? This might benefit from more effective policing. Why do you think, or why did you and both your husband decide that one of the more effective ways to serve your community was the police force when they're often demonized?
I think when we both joined, it wasn't demonized. We were still very well respected. We were welcome in the communities. I worked in the schools for 8 years. I became mom with a lot of these kids. They didn't have home structures, right. And they needed a mother, and I became their mother, basically. And to this day, I still have kids who are, I call them kids, but they're 30 years old on the street. They call me mom. Wow. I never inspired to be a police officer. I was going to be a veterinarian.
Really?
How I got into the police work, I don't know. David talked me into it, and I've loved it, and I've been there ever since. I mean, even 27 years later, I still enjoy my job. I still have fun. I still love helping people.
And I think that's something that's often lost on people. Not all teachers are great. Not all cops are great. Not all of anyone in any profession are great. But there are a lot of people who go into a profession to serve their community. And I think particularly, at least as we experience in Detroit, people who are members of a minority community going into a profession where right now the tone has changed to that of hostility. There's really no other you're not doing it to be Mr. Popular. Let me ask you this. Why do you think it is that this story with your husband has received comparatively so little media coverage? And we've done everything that we can, but we're obviously only one show. But the big ABC, NBC, CBS, almost nothing.
The easiest answer is it doesn't fit their narrative. It doesn't fit the narrative of, a policeman killing a black man. It doesn't, it's a black on black crime. We have those every day in St. Louis. And I hate to say that. It's very sad. That's one component that we need to fix with this Peace March, and then we need to address. All lives are precious. Right. Every life out there is precious. And he just didn't fit the narrative. He did get a blurb from the local news because he was very loved in our community. Right. But, nationally, it didn't fit their narrative. Right. It didn't fit their, and I wouldn't even just say it didn't fit their narrative. It didn't fit the truth. It didn't fit the reason that I see, obviously, you and your husband joined the police force, as he said, to serve the community. You just mentioned black on black crime. If we're going to talk about all Black Lives Matter, it's the number one cause of death for young black Americans under the age of 44 is homicide. Police, it doesn't even make the list. And I've got to imagine that was something that being in a city like St. Louis, both you and your husband encountered every day. And like you said, the brokenness from people who are the victims of these crimes. That is something that needs to be dealt with, and it's not being discussed. What was your experience like with that and your husband coming home from those kinds of crimes in those kinds of neighborhoods? It was difficult. I mean, we really had a lot of conversations about it. And coming from his perspective, the narrative for Black Lives Matter for him, his words were, until every Black life matters, the young black children, the elderly blacks who are being killed, until Black Lives Matter starts supporting them and protesting because those black children were being killed, their narrative didn't hold merit at that point. Right. Because there was no, they didn't support the black children. We've had, I don't know how many, 14, 15 black children, and I say children under the age of 12, murdered in the city of St. Louis. And there's not been one protest. There's not been one rally for them or outcry from Black Lives Matter for their deaths. Right. And that's what matters in our community. If our youth are being killed and just murdered senselessly and nobody cares, why would anybody care then?
Right. And after the protests and the riots are long gone, and Sanjay Gupta packs up his remote camera and leaves, and Anderson Cooper goes on to hosting a redux of The Mole, it's people like your husband and yourself who are left to deal with the rubble. And like you said, another 12, 15, 30, 40 young black Americans killed, and nothing has been done to solve that problem. I wanted to ask you, because you talked about, and we do have to get going here relatively soon, and my robe got caught under my wheel like an idiot. I apologize. You talked about finding out where the brokenness comes from, the problems. You said it starts at home. Where do you think the problem is most, I guess, egregious right now? How do we help as police officers who've worked so closely with those in the black community, those in not only the black community, but in St. Louis, people, we talk about poverty right now, a lot of poor people, people under the poverty line who are white people in St. Louis. It's a pretty diverse city. What do you think the problem is, if not the narrative from the media that it's police brutality? Where do we start?
We start in the home. We have to start back in the homes. We have to get the nucleus of the home reestablished. Parents in the home, parents actually being parents, not letting the streets raise their children, not letting their friends raise them. There has to be parents involved. My mother was a single mother who raised 5 girls.
Oof.
Yeah.
That sounds like it'd be tough.
She was a mother and a father.
Right.
And sometimes parents have to take that on. But if you're not a parent and you don't keep up with your child, you don't know what they're getting into. You don't know what if you're not the one influencing, someone is.
Right. And let me ask you this, as a police officer, and you obviously would have to deal with, I assume, some repeat offenders, the young people who come in who are problems, right, who you deal with on an ongoing basis, people who sort of have their regular punch card with the St. Louis PD, what percentage or how often would you say those problem children, young adults, what percentage of them didn't have parents or were missing one parent?
I would say a majority of them were missing a parent or being raised by a grandparent. Mm-hmm. And it showed, the grandparents were doing everything they could to raise the next generation. And most of them were moving on into their older years and just couldn't raise a child like they used to.
Right.
Or the parents were struggling.
Right.
We've had some phenomenal parents that I've dealt with in years, because I've dealt with juveniles and stuff for many, many years. We've had phenomenal parents, and every once in a while a kid slips through the cracks. But the parents who want to be a parent and the parents who are there fighting and trying to raise their child right, they're far and few between. I mean, there's many of them, and I'll do anything I can to help any parent out there get back on their feet, help them figure out what they need. I've done it for years. I'll spend time with them. I'll get them hooked up with social services. I'll get them counseling, parenting classes, you name it. We have it.
Right.
There are services out there. They're just not being utilized the way they need to be.
I think that's an important point. A lot of people think that if you just throw more money at it, it'll solve the problem, whereas we have some services that aren't being used or aren't being effectively managed, as we see in a lot of municipalities. And forgive me for asking this question. You can tell me if you don't want to answer it, but I believe it was, I think Quarterback Garrett was a son who talked about your husband's death. And I believe that he said, this is a way he would have rather gone out serving his community and doing the right thing than just kind of living into old age. I know as a wife that's not something that you would ever want for any. You never want to lose them. But is there a part of you that finds some solace in the fact that this was a guy who, there's no more clear definition of a hero, of a man who served his community while he lived, and he served his community in death. And is there a part of you that appreciates that or makes it any easier?
Yeah, it does. He did go out a hero. He went out fighting, the good fight, helping people. I believe everything happens for a reason. Mm-hmm. And, he's going to speak through me. And I'm hoping the reason is to help heal the city, to realize, hey, he didn't have to die. The young man didn't have to pull that trigger. Right. There's alternatives. There was no reason to pull the trigger and take David's life.
Yeah.
But David went out honorably, fighting. So I can't ask for anything more. I wouldn't have wanted it to happen that way. I'd like to grow old with him.
Right.
But if he had to die like this, then yes.
Yeah.
He went out of here, and I'm just hoping I can bring meaning to it. And
I know, and it's
that
hard
his death not in vain.
Well, I will tell you this: his death was absolutely not in vain, and we'll do everything that we can. We have been trying to, and as you know, all the proceeds from these shirts will be going to you directly and your family. And I know it's no easier of a pill to swallow, but I will say, from an outside perspective, I know that your husband and that story not only enraged everyone here at this studio, but really impassioned people at this studio. It went from, all right, this is going maybe a little bit off the edge, to nope. Line in the sand drawn. This is something that cannot continue. There can be no other David Dorns, and I think inspired a lot of people to go out and not only support officers, but specifically to draw attention to minority officers, black officers who are trying to serve their community and are being wrongly vilified. And you know what? I would go even further. Not only did that man not have to pull the trigger, that man didn't need to steal a TV. That man didn't need to be looting. We often hear, well, it's a byproduct of poverty that people steal because, well, he wasn't going out getting essentials. He was going out getting a Vizio. And you know what? Your husband also didn't have to show up and help a friend's business. And so I think what defines us is not only how we live and how we die, but what we do when faced with decisions that we don't really have to make. And that's why I think maybe subliminally, a lot of people don't realize this with your husband's story, but they understand, they absorb the fact that that person didn't have to steal a TV. There was no requirement to make that decision. His back wasn't against a wall. And your husband didn't have to go out in his 70s to protect a man's business. Wasn't his job? No one would even know if he had never done it. But when no one's looking and no one is forcing you to make a decision, and you are compelled to make the right decision, that is indicative of character. And I think that's why your husband's story was and is so inspirational to all of us, and we want to do everything that we can to help and support you guys. So I know the march is August 29th in downtown St. Louis. One more time, there's a Facebook group where people can go, Ms. Dorn?
Yes, Peace March STL. It's 9 a.m. August 29th, and we're going to be meeting in front of police headquarters at 1915 Olive, and we're going to be walking down to the civil courthouse at 10 South Tucker.
Okay.
There will be shirts for sale. We're red, white, and blue are our colors.
Okay.
And,
absolutely. Well, I appreciate it. And listen, I know the media often moves on. This would happen, with Stephen Williford back then in the Sutherland Springs. We don't. You have our contact info. You have our information. And I demand that you reach out if there's ever anything that we can do, because I know that sometimes it can become a lonely feeling when people have moved on to the next thing. We try not to. So, Mrs. Dorn, thank you so much. I wish you the best with that march, and I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Stephen, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. God bless. Be well.